United States Senator Bill Cassidy here, and it's great to mark National Clean Energy Week with an honest discussion about an energy future. Now first, the United States leads the world in emissions reductions. U.S. manufacturing is the cleanest in the world with the lowest carbon intensity. Our natural gas is the cleanest throughout its life cycle of production and use. So policies that only focus on reducing domestic emissions often shift production overseas to places like China, which produces more emissions than anyone else on a kind of per unit of production basis. Global emissions then go up. Our goal needs to be to reduce global emissions. And since U.S. energy is the cleanest, the solution seems obvious. We need to make more cleanly produced U.S. natural gas competitive with the less cleanly produced Russian gas by unleashing American energy production. I've called for an Operation Warp Speed so that the United States can supply us and our allies with the world's cleanest life cycle, if you will, burning energy and bring down global emissions. To accomplish that, we need extensive and thorough permitting reform, and half measures will not be enough. We must ensure that companies and manufacturers who are actively working to lower carbon intensity can build more production. And as long as the world is demanding carbon-intensive products, and by the way, they're essential for modernity, think chemicals and jet fuel, and we are producing those products more cleanly than anyone else, we should encourage domestic production. But that's only half the solution. We also need to make sure that U.S. manufacturing is competitive with Chinese manufacturing. Now, why would that be? Well, first, let's just acknowledge that China is the largest emitter in the world and is driving global emissions. And China makes a conscious decision not to enforce environmental regulations, which therefore lowers the cost of production in China, attracting industry to China. The combined decrease of the emissions in the EU and the UK and the US since the early 2000s is dwarfed by the increase in Chinese emissions over the same time. Indeed, China went from being 19th and 20th in the world in emissions and manufacturing in 2000 to being first in both by a long measure. So reliance on cheap manufacturing from China, paired with China's willingness to ignore international emission standards, has incentivized China to continue to emit with impunity. We need solutions that meet at the nexus of climate policy, energy policy, and I would add national security and economic policy to effectively counter China. The challenge is how to create a race to the top in controlling emissions rather than a race to the bottom. I've discussed a carbon border adjustment to encourage that competition and to lower emissions intensity in a way that benefits the United States and our allies and indeed the world. A carbon border adjustment effectively enforces or incentivizes the use of U.S. and EU environmental standards everywhere. If you want to do business with the United States, and if we form a buyers club with the EU with both, you can no longer undermine global efforts to reduce global emissions. Now, Chinese economic growth, which has depended upon ignoring emissions, now depends upon acknowledging those emissions and lowering them. So when approaching climate policy, we must have a globally focused, multi-pronged strategy. It is possible to write meaningful climate policy without sacrificing national security, energy security, or economic growth. I'm thankful for the opportunity to continue the discussion on just how to do that. Thank you.